hormones, ADHD, and OCD. Why your daughter's brain feels different throughout the month and nobody explained to you or her. Why? What if your daughter is not lazy? What if she is not dramatic, irrational, disrespectful, suddenly not trying, or going through some mysterious personality change that appeared out of nowhere? What if her ADHD symptoms, her OCD flares, her anxiety spikes, her rage, her exhaustion, her sensory sensitivity, her low motivation, or feeling emotionally overwhelmed are not random at all? What if the truth is that her brain, a brain that is already wired differently, may literally function differently depending on where she is in her hormonal cycle? Here is what that can look like in a real week. One week, she wakes up and feels almost like herself. She answers texts. She gets something accomplished. She tolerates frustration a little better. She comes out of her room. She eats something without a battle. She might even laugh at something. She surprises herself, and she surprises you. Then, something shifts. The laundry feels impossible. Not, I don't want to do it, impossible. Neurologically, cognitively, physically impossible, like her brain cannot locate the sequence of steps required to begin. Her socks feel wrong, the seam, the pressure, the texture. The thing that felt fine last Tuesday now feels unbearable, and she cannot explain why. And she knows it sounds irrational, and that knowledge makes it worse. The smallest request, "Did you eat something today?" lands like an accusation. She knows you mean well. She cannot access that knowledge in the moment. What she can access is the feeling that the question is too much, too loud, too demanding. The sound of someone chewing in the next room becomes unbearable in a way she cannot regulate and cannot escape. Her emotions feel bigger, closer to the surface, harder to manage. Things she could tolerate last week now feel catastrophic. She is exhausted before the day begins, not because she stayed up too late, but because her body and her brain have been running on fumes and nobody told her why, and because nobody ever explained to her that hormones directly influence how ADHD, OCD, anxiety, and emotional regulation behave in the female brain. She has spent years quietly arriving at the only conclusion that seems available to her. What is wrong with me? And because you are watching this from across the kitchen table or the hallway, and because you love her and you are exhausted too, and because nobody explained it to you either, you have sometimes quietly arrived at your own conclusion. She just isn't trying. But what if neither of you is right? What if what you are witnessing is a neurological and hormonal event happening inside a brain and body that were never designed with her in mind when the research was written? That is what today's episode is about. Welcome back to the Path to Peace Therapy podcast. I'm Stephanie Buckley, parenting strategist and family systems coach specializing in ADHD, executive functioning, OCD, anxiety, emotional regulation, and the patterns that keep families stuck in the same arguments on repeat. I'm also a mom to a thriving 23-year-old neurodivergent son with ADHD and OCD, and I've been married for over 3 decades. I created this podcast because I remember exactly what it felt like to watch behaviors that didn't make sense and have no language for what I was seeing. I remember wondering whether what I was witnessing was attitude, laziness, defiance, or something else entirely. What I eventually learned through my clinical work and through my own family is that behavior is never just behavior. It is always communication, from the brain, from the nervous system, from the body, and from the family system. Today, we are diving into one of the most under-discussed, under-researched, and deeply misunderstood conversations in women's mental health: the relationship between hormones, ADHD, OCD, anxiety, rage, heavy periods, birth control, ferritin levels, sleep, gut health, and why so many girls and women feel like a completely different version of themselves depending on the week of the month. This episode is long, but really thorough. I am going to explain every term I introduce because if this is the first time you've heard some of these concepts, you deserve a full explanation, not a quick mention. I am going to speak to you parents, and I am also going to speak directly to you, young women who may be listening and finally finding language for something you have felt your entire lives but never had words for. Hormones. What are they and why do they matter? Let's start at the foundation because before we can talk about how hormones interact with ADHD, OCD, and anxiety, you need to understand what hormones actually are and what they do. Hormones are chemical messengers. Think of them like text messages that travel through the bloodstream, sent from one part of the body to another, carrying very specific instructions. One hormone says, wake up. Another says, slow down and rest. Another says, prepare the uterus for a potential pregnancy. Another says, it's time to bleed. But here's what most people don't realize. Hormones don't just manage reproduction. They influence mood, energy, focus, sleep, appetite, digestion, motivation, frustration tolerance, sensory sensitivity, emotional regulation, anxiety levels, OCD intensity, and even how well ADHD medication works or doesn't work on a given day. For most people, most boys, most men, and even most girls who were never told this, hormones are something that just happen in puberty and then sort of sit in the background of life. But for girls and women with ADHD, the hormonal system is not background noise. It is one of the loudest instruments in the orchestra. And when it changes, which it does every single week, it changes everything else too. Before we go into the specific hormones that matter most, let me offer you a reference point that many people already understand intuitively. Most people who follow sports have heard the term roid rage. When men take high doses of testosterone or anabolic steroids, which are synthetic hormones, people around them often notice significant changes in aggression, impulsivity, mood swings, irritability, and emotional intensity. We accept this almost without question. We say, of course he's pumped full of artificial hormones. That's going to change his behavior. We don't question whether the behavior is real. We don't tell him he's being dramatic. We accept the connection between what is happening hormonally and what is happening behaviorally. Now let's talk about the specific hormones that matter most. Estrogen, the brain's best friend, when it's there. What is estrogen? Estrogen is often referred to as the female hormone, but that description dramatically undersells what it actually does. Estrogen is a steroid hormone, which means it's made from cholesterol, and it plays a central role in the female reproductive system. But it also crosses the blood-brain barrier, which is the protective filter between the bloodstream and the brain. And once it's in the brain, it acts like a neurological amplifier. Here is what estrogen does in the brain that matters for ADHD and OCD. Estrogen increases the availability and sensitivity of dopamine receptors. Dopamine is a neurotransmitter, a chemical that neurons in the brain use to communicate with each other, and it is the neurotransmitter most associated with focus, motivation, reward, working memory, and the ability to start and complete tasks. ADHD is fundamentally a dopamine dysregulation disorder. The ADHD brain does not produce, release, or receive dopamine efficiently. This is why ADHD medications like Vyvanse and Adderall, which we'll talk about in detail later, are stimulants that work by increasing dopamine availability. Estrogen also increases serotonin activity. Serotonin is another neurotransmitter deeply linked to mood stability, emotional regulation, impulse control, and OCD. Many antidepressants, including SSRIs like Lexapro, which we'll also discuss, work by keeping serotonin available in the brain longer. Estrogen essentially does some of that same work naturally. Estrogen also supports the prefrontal cortex, which is the area of the brain responsible for executive functions, planning, organizing, initiating tasks, managing time, controlling impulses, and regulating emotions. The prefrontal cortex is the part of the brain most affected by ADHD. When estrogen is present and active, the prefrontal cortex gets a boost. When estrogen drops, that boost goes away. When estrogen is high, the ADHD brain gets better dopamine, better serotonin, and better prefrontal cortex support. When estrogen drops, the ADHD brain loses those supports, and it feels like the floor has fallen out from under her. How estrogen affects the ADHD brain in day-to-day life. Scenario 1. The good week. It's day 9 of the cycle. Estrogen is rising toward its first peak. Your daughter comes downstairs at a reasonable hour. She makes herself something to eat without being prompted. She responds to a text from a friend within an hour instead of 3 days. She sits down and does 45 minutes of homework without leaving the room 12 times. You quietly think, maybe things are getting better. She quietly thinks, maybe I'm not as broken as I thought. What's actually happening is that her estrogen is up, which means her dopamine system is working more efficiently, and her prefrontal cortex is getting more support than it gets in other weeks. This is not her being fixed. This is her being hormonally supported. It's a real biological state, and it deserves to be celebrated without the unspoken implication that she could always be like this if she just tried. Scenario 2, the medication roller coaster. Your daughter takes ADHD medication daily. You and her doctor have landed on a dose that seemed to work. But there are weeks where the medication feels barely there. She's restless, scattered, overwhelmed by small demands, and can't seem to get traction. Then other weeks, the same dose feels almost too strong. She's hyper-focused to the point of rigidity and has no appetite. Nobody changed the prescription. What changed is her estrogen level. When estrogen is lower, the medication has to do more of the heavy lifting with less neurological support, and it may feel insufficient. When estrogen is higher, the brain is already primed, and the same dose can feel amplified. Tracking symptoms alongside the cycle, even loosely, can help a prescribing physician understand whether dose adjustments or timing changes might help during specific phases. Scenario 4, the social withdrawal. You notice that for a predictable stretch of time each month, your daughter goes quiet. She stops initiating with friends, she cancels plans, she stays in her room more. You wonder if she's depressed. You wonder if something happened socially. You ask, and she says, "I'm fine," in a tone that clearly communicates she is not fine. What she doesn't have language for is that when estrogen is low, social motivation and the neurological reward she gets from connection drops significantly. For the ADHD brain, which already struggles with initiation and often relies on external stimulation to engage, the withdrawal of estrogen's dopamine support can make social interaction feel less rewarding and far more effortful than usual. Scenario 5, the sensory overload week. During high estrogen phases, your daughter seems to tolerate the usual chaos of home life fairly well. During low estrogen phases, the same stimuli, the television in the background, the smell of dinner cooking, the dog barking, someone asking a question while she's doing something else, become almost physically intolerable. She snaps. She leaves the room. She puts on headphones and doesn't come out. This happens because estrogen plays a role in how the nervous system processes and filters sensory input. ADHD already involves challenges with sensory filtering. When estrogen drops, that filter becomes even less effective, and stimuli that were manageable become overwhelming. She is not choosing to be sensitive. Her nervous system is running without its support structure. Progesterone, the calming hormone that can calm too much. What is progesterone? Progesterone is the other primary female sex hormone, and it has a very different role from estrogen. After ovulation, which we'll explain in the cycle section, progesterone rises. Its job is to prepare the uterine lining for a potential pregnancy. But like estrogen, it also crosses into the brain and has significant effects on neurological function. Progesterone converts in the brain into a compound called allopregnanolone, and allopregnanolone is a GABA agonist. Let me explain what that means because it matters enormously. GABA stands for gamma-aminobutyric acid, and it is the brain's primary inhibitory neurotransmitter. If you imagine the brain as a room full of activity, GABA is the volume dial that turns things down. It slows firing, creates calm, and supports sleep. Medications like benzodiazepines, think Xanax or Valium, work by increasing GABA activity. Alcohol also increases GABA, which is part of why it creates a sedating effect. When allopregnanolone is present, which happens during the second half of the cycle, when progesterone is high, GABA activity increases. For some women, this creates a lovely sense of calm. For the ADHD brain, however, which already runs low on the neurological stimulation it needs to focus and stay motivated, too much GABA can feel sedating, flattening, and cognitively slowing. It can feel like thinking through fog, like motivation has been turned off, like everything requires twice the effort for half the output. Additionally, rising progesterone is accompanied by declining estrogen, which means the dopamine and serotonin support from estrogen is also falling away at the same time progesterone is rising. The result is a brain that loses its stimulation supports while simultaneously gaining sedating effects. This is the luteal phase, the 2 weeks before the period, and it is often the most difficult stretch for girls and women with ADHD. How progesterone affects the ADHD brain, a day in the life. Scenario 1. The motivation cliff. Around day 16 or 17 of the cycle, progesterone begins to rise. Your daughter, who was relatively functional the week before, suddenly feels like she's moving through wet concrete. She's not sad exactly. She's flat. She's not refusing to do things exactly. She just cannot locate any reason to start. She scrolls. She lies on her bed and stares at the ceiling. She knows she has things to do. She can see the list. She cannot activate. This is not laziness. This is the dopamine-depleting, GABA amplifying effect of rising progesterone meeting an ADHD brain that was already struggling with activation and initiation. Scenario 2, the cognitive fog. You've heard her describe it. My brain feels like it's underwater. During the progesterone dominant phase, verbal fluency, the ability to find and express words, quickly often declines. Processing speed slows. She pauses mid-sentence and loses the word she was looking for. She forgets what she walked into the room to do. She reads an assignment and cannot understand what it's asking. She's not being careless. The progesterone-driven increase in GABA activity is genuinely slowing her cognitive processing, on top of the executive functioning challenges that ADHD already creates. Scenario 3, the emotional amplifier. Progesterone does not cause sadness exactly, but it does interact with serotonin pathways in a way that can increase emotional sensitivity and reactivity. For a girl with OCD, this phase is particularly difficult because when serotonin is less available, OCD thoughts called intrusive thoughts, which are unwanted, distressing thoughts the brain fixates on, become louder and harder to dismiss. For a girl with ADHD, who already struggles with emotional dysregulation, the difficulty managing emotional responses proportionately, the progesterone phase can feel like every emotion is turned up 2 notches beyond her ability to contain it. Scenario 4, the sleep disruption. Progesterone, particularly in the late luteal phase, the final days before the period begins, can disrupt sleep despite its sedating reputation. Body temperature increases. Night sweats can occur even in teenagers and young adults. Restless legs may appear. She may fall asleep easily but wake repeatedly or not reach the deep restorative stages of sleep she needs. Poor sleep in an ADHD brain is catastrophic. The ADHD brain is already working harder during the day to compensate for its neurological differences. When sleep is compromised, every symptom, attention, impulse control, emotional regulation, executive function worsens significantly. Scenario 5, the physical exhaustion. In the days just before the period when progesterone is at its highest before it crashes, some women with ADHD experience a physical fatigue that is disproportionate to their activity level. They are not tired from doing too much. They are exhausted from the hormonal environment their brain and body are navigating. Requesting that she just push through it is the equivalent of telling someone with a broken leg to just walk it off. The injury is real. It simply isn't visible. The menstrual cycle, a week-by-week guide for ADHD brains. Most girls are taught the basics of menstruation in a school health class that spends approximately 20 minutes on the topic, mostly focused on what a period is and how to manage it physically. Almost nobody is taught that the menstrual cycle is a 28 to 35-day hormonal event that influences brain chemistry, mood, cognition, energy, sensory processing, and emotional regulation every single day. Let's walk through it properly. Phase 1, menstruation days, 1 through 5, approximately. Day 1 is the first day of bleeding. Both estrogen and progesterone are at their lowest points. For some women with ADHD, the beginning of menstruation actually brings a kind of neurological relief. The hormonal tension of the luteal phase breaks, progesterone crashes, and even though estrogen is low, the extreme sedating effect of progesterone is gone. Some women describe this as finally being able to breathe again. However, the physical symptoms of menstruation, cramping, bloating, heavy bleeding, fatigue, and sometimes nausea, create their own demands on the nervous system. For the ADHD brain, which struggles to manage competing sensory and physical inputs, menstruation adds a significant physical load on top of the cognitive one. Pain in particular consumes neurological resources. A brain managing pain has fewer resources available for focus, working memory, and emotional regulation. Girls with heavy periods, and we will spend significant time on heavy periods in a later section because this is a critical and underappreciated topic, face an additional burden during this phase. Heavy bleeding leads to iron loss. Iron depletion leads to fatigue, brain fog, and worsening ADHD symptoms. This is not a minor detail. This is a major contributor that is frequently missed. Phase 2, the follicular phase, days 6 through 13, approximately. After menstruation ends, estrogen begins to rise as the body prepares to release an egg, a process called ovulation. This rising estrogen phase is, for most women with ADHD, the best phase of the month. Dopamine receptor sensitivity is increasing. Serotonin availability is improving. The prefrontal cortex is getting more neurological support. Working memory is stronger. Verbal fluency is better. Motivation is more accessible. Frustration tolerance is higher. Emotional regulation is more reliable. The window is wider for learning, for emotional conversations, for making plans, for getting things done. For parents, if you have something important to discuss with your daughter, a conversation about school, relationships, future plans, a difficult topic that has been building the follicular phase is the most neurologically supportive window for that conversation. This is not manipulation. This is meeting her brain where it is most available. For young women, this is the window to front load, to do the hard things, to have the difficult conversations with yourself, to make appointments, fill out forms, return calls, begin projects. Not because you should be using every good day productively, but because understanding your hormonal cycle means you can plan with your biology rather than against it. Phase 3, ovulation. Around day 14, estrogen reaches its peak just before ovulation, and there is also a brief surge of testosterone. Yes, women have testosterone too, in smaller amounts, which further supports motivation, confidence, and libido. Many women report feeling most socially engaged, most energetic, most cognitively clear, and most emotionally stable around ovulation. After ovulation, estrogen drops briefly before rising again more gently, and progesterone begins its rise. Phase 4, the luteal phase, days 15 through 28, approximately. This is the phase we have been building toward, because for women and girls with ADHD, this is where things often become most difficult. Progesterone rises and stays elevated during the first half of the luteal phase. Estrogen rises slightly again, but then begins to fall. In the second half of the luteal phase, the 10 to 14 days before the period begins, both estrogen and progesterone decline, and this declining estrogen is what drives premenstrual symptoms. For girls with ADHD, the late luteal phase, sometimes the last 7 to 10 days before the period, can look like a completely different person. ADHD symptoms worsen measurably. OCD symptoms intensify. Anxiety spikes. Emotional regulation deteriorates. Rage can emerge. Sensory sensitivity is heightened. Executive function becomes more compromised. Sleep is disrupted. Motivation drops to near zero. This is not a character issue. This is not a choice. This is a neurological event happening inside a brain that was already working at a disadvantage, and it is happening on a predictable schedule every single month. There is a clinical term for the most severe version of what happens in the late luteal phase, PMDD, which stands for premenstrual dysphoric disorder. PMDD is not just bad PMS. It is a recognized psychiatric disorder in the DSM-5, the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, which is the reference guide clinicians use to diagnose mental health conditions. PMDD involves severe mood disruption, suicidal ideation in some cases, inability to function, rage, and despair that begins in the late luteal phase and resolves within a day or two of the period starting. A DHD significantly increases the risk of PMDD. If any of what you are hearing today sounds like more than just difficult months, if it sounds like a crisis that recurs monthly, please bring this to a psychiatrist or OBGYN who is familiar with PMDD. Rage, the neurology and hormones behind it. What is rage in the ADHD context? Let's talk about rage directly, because it is one of the most frightening and least understood experiences in the ADHD family system, and it carries enormous shame for the person experiencing it and for the family witnessing it. Rage in the ADHD context is not the same as anger. Anger is a proportionate emotional response to a perceived injustice or threat. Anger says, I am upset about this specific thing. Rage is something different. Rage is an emotional flooding that bypasses the rational brain almost entirely and takes over the body and behavior before the person experiencing it has any meaningful chance to intercept it. There is a term you may have heard in ADHD circles, RSD, which stands for rejection sensitive dysphoria. Dysphoria means intense emotional pain. RSD refers to the extreme emotional pain that can be triggered in an ADHD brain by real or perceived rejection, criticism, failure, or the sense of having disappointed someone important. For many people with ADHD, RSD doesn't produce sadness. It produces explosive rage that appears wildly disproportionate to what just happened. Neurologically, here is what is happening. The amygdala, the part of the brain that processes threat and generates the emotional alarm response, fires intensely. In a typically regulated brain, the prefrontal cortex, the rational executive part of the brain, receives that signal and helps moderate it. Yes, this situation is frustrating, but let's assess before we react. In the ADHD brain, the prefrontal cortex is already underconnected to the amygdala. The emotional alarm fires at full intensity, and the moderating system does not engage quickly enough to prevent the explosion. Now add the hormones. In the late luteal phase, when estrogen and progesterone are both declining, serotonin availability drops. Serotonin is directly involved in impulse control and emotional regulation. The amygdala becomes more reactive. The prefrontal cortex loses even more of the serotonin support it needs to moderate emotional responses. The result is an ADHD brain already prone to emotional flooding, operating with reduced neurochemical resources for emotional regulation in a body that is also in physical discomfort. Rage is the outcome. Hormonal rage in the ADHD day in the life of your daughter. Scenario 1, the door slam. It's 3 days before her period. You ask her to put her dishes in the sink. She slams her door so hard a picture falls off the wall in the hallway. You stand in the kitchen, dishes still on the table, wondering what just happened. What happened is that her amygdala received, "Can you put your dishes away?" And without the serotonin, without the estrogen, without the neurological buffering that might have been available last week, it processed that request as intolerable intrusion. The door slam is not about the dishes. It is the output of a nervous system that is flooded and has no other exit. Scenario 2, the crying rage. Some girls and women with ADHD experience rage that comes out as explosive crying, screaming through tears, a kind of emotional storm that is both intensely sad and intensely furious at once. This is confusing for parents who aren't sure whether to respond to the anger or the sadness. The answer is both are real. Both are happening simultaneously. The ADHD brain, when emotionally flooded, does not produce neat, categorized emotions. It produces everything at once through whatever exit is available. Scenario 3, the verbal eruption that she regrets. In the late luteal phase, a girl with ADHD and RSD may say things in a moment of rage that she immediately regrets, things she doesn't mean, things that are cruel, things that she knows are untrue the second they leave her mouth. She is horrified. She is ashamed. She may come to you an hour later, crying, trying to explain. The neurological reality is that once the amygdala floods, verbal impulse control, which is already a significant area of challenge in ADHD, collapses further. The words are real feelings at maximum intensity, but they are not her carefully considered truth. Holding the space for repair after these moments, rather than retaliating or withdrawing, is one of the most powerful things a parent can do. Scenario 4, the rage that follows failure. She gets an assignment back with a grade that is lower than she expected. She worked on that assignment. She tried. The grade doesn't reflect the effort. Her face goes immediately from disappointment to rage, flipping a notebook, snapping at whoever is nearby, declaring that school is pointless, and she hates all of it. This is RSD meeting a compromised neurological state. The failure activates the deep shame that many ADHD brains carry about not being enough, and the hormonal environment removes the buffering that might have allowed her to contain that response. Scenario 5, the parent who becomes the target. A painful truth for many families. The parent who is closest, safest, and most trusted is often the target of the most intense rage. This is not an accident. The ADHD nervous system, when flooded, attacks towards safety. She knows you won't leave. She knows you'll still be there. For a brain that has no other outlet, you become the place where the explosion is safe to land. This does not make it okay. It does not mean you should absorb abuse, but understanding why it is happening, why it is you and not her teacher or her friend, can help you respond from a less personally wounded place. Your differentiation as a parent, your ability to stay grounded in your own identity and not emotionally merge with her crisis is one of the most important things you can develop through this period of her life. OCD and hormones. The connection. Nobody is talking about. What is OCD? Obsessive compulsive disorder. OCD is a brain-based condition characterized by intrusive thoughts, obsessions, that cause significant distress, and repetitive behaviors or mental acts, compulsions, that the person performs in an attempt to reduce that distress. It is critical to understand that OCD is not about being organized or liking things clean. It is a disorder involving genuine neurological loops. The brain fires a signal of alarm. The person responds with a behavior meant to neutralize the alarm. The behavior provides temporary relief, the alarm fires again, and the cycle repeats. OCD involves dysfunction in the cortico-striatothalamo-cortical circuit, a neural circuit that connects the prefrontal cortex to deeper brain structures involved in habit, threat detection, and behavioral inhibition. It is also deeply connected to serotonin. The standard treatment for OCD involves SSR, is selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors medications that keep serotonin available in the brain longer. This is not coincidental. Here is where hormones become critical. Estrogen increases serotonin activity. When estrogen drops, as it does in the late luteal phase, serotonin drops too. And when serotonin drops, OCD symptoms intensify. The intrusive thoughts become louder. The compulsions feel more urgent. The reassurance seeking increases. The rituals expand. The distress escalates. For girls and young women with both ADHD and OCD, which is not an uncommon combination, the late luteal phase can produce a genuinely destabilizing experience. The ADHD is worsening because of low estrogen and dopamine. The OCD is worsening because of low estrogen and serotonin. The emotional regulation is compromised. And nobody has explained to her that this is happening on a hormonal schedule, which means she has no framework for predicting it, preparing for it, or knowing that it will ease when her period comes. How OCD flares with hormones. Scenario 1. The reassurance loop. Every month in the 10 days before her period, she begins seeking reassurance compulsively. Are you sure you're not mad at me? Did I do something wrong? You don't hate me, right? She asks repeatedly, gets your reassurance, feels better for 45 minutes, and asks again. You are exhausted. She is exhausted. This is a hormonal OCD flare. The intrusive thought is, the people I love are angry at me or about to leave me, and the compulsion is reassurance seeking. The serotonin drop has turned up the volume on this loop, and her brain cannot find relief through the usual channels. Scenario 2. The contamination spike. She has OCD that includes contamination concerns, worries about germs, illness, touching certain things. During most of the month, with the support of therapy and sometimes medication, these concerns are manageable. But in the late luteal phase, the same triggers that were manageable 3 weeks ago become intolerable. She cannot use the shared bathroom. She washes her hands until they crack. She cannot eat food that was prepared a certain way. Her therapist may not know this is hormonal. Her parents may not know this is hormonal. She definitely doesn't know this is hormonal. She just knows she's getting worse, and she doesn't know why. Scenario 3. The intrusive thoughts that terrify her. One of the most distressing and least talked about features of OCD is intrusive thoughts that are morally repugnant to the person experiencing them, thoughts about harm, about contamination, about terrible things happening. These thoughts are ego-dystonic, meaning they are completely opposed to the person's actual values and desires. They horrify her. They do not mean she wants to act on them. They are brain noise, but in the late luteal phase, when serotonin is low, these thoughts become louder, more frequent, and harder to dismiss. She may not tell you about them because she is ashamed and afraid of what you'll think. If you ever wonder why she becomes suddenly more anxious and withdrawn each month, this may be part of why. Scenario 4. The rigidity and ritual escalation. She has routines that help her manage OCD, getting ready in a specific order, checking the stove a certain number of times, saying goodbye in a particular way. During high estrogen phases, she can sometimes be flexible with these routines when life requires it. During the late luteal phase, the flexibility disappears. The routines become rigid requirements. Any disruption running late, someone else in the bathroom, the morning plan changing, can trigger a crisis. This is not her choosing to be inflexible. Her brain, deprived of serotonin, cannot tolerate the uncertainty that flexibility requires. Scenario 5. The SSRI that seems less effective. She takes an SSRI, perhaps Lexapro, for OCD and anxiety. The dose has been stable. It has been helping. But every month, in the week or two before her period, it feels like the medication has stopped working. She has more intrusive thoughts. Her compulsions are harder to resist. Her anxiety is higher. Her prescriber may not have asked about her cycle. But what is happening is that her estrogen drop is reducing serotonin availability at the synaptic level. The connection points between neurons and the SSRI is having to work against a hormonal environment that is actively reducing serotonin. This is a known interaction in the psychiatric literature, and it is worth bringing explicitly to her prescribing physician. Ferritin, iron, and the labs you need to know about. Why labs matter for ADHD, OCD, anxiety, and hormones. Before we go further, I want to take a dedicated section to talk about blood work, specifically the labs that are frequently overlooked when a girl or young woman is struggling with ADHD symptoms, mood, energy, and cognitive function. This matters deeply because many of the symptoms we attribute entirely to ADHD, OCD, anxiety, or hormonal shifts are in fact being driven or significantly worsened by nutritional deficiencies that a simple blood test can identify. Ferritin, the most important test you may never have heard of. Ferritin is a protein that stores iron in the body. It is the body's iron reserve, the warehouse where iron is kept when it isn't immediately being used. You can have an iron level that looks normal on a standard blood panel, while your ferritin, your stored iron, is critically depleted. This distinction is important because most standard blood panels check serum iron, not ferritin, and a clinician who doesn't specifically order ferritin can completely miss a serious deficiency. Here is why ferritin matters so profoundly for ADHD. Iron is required for the production of dopamine. Dopamine is made from an amino acid called tyrosine, and that conversion process requires iron as a cofactor, meaning iron is one of the essential ingredients. Without adequate iron stores, the brain cannot produce dopamine efficiently. And because ADHD is already a dopamine dysregulation disorder, low ferritin can dramatically worsen ADHD symptoms, inattention, working memory problems, emotional dysregulation, and executive function challenges independently of anything else going on. Research has consistently found that children and adults with ADHD tend to have lower ferritin levels than neurotypical peers, and that ferritin supplementation, when deficiency is identified, can improve ADHD symptoms sometimes significantly. For girls and women who have heavy periods, ferritin depletion is a recurring risk every single month. Every heavy period loses a significant amount of blood, and blood loss means iron loss, and iron loss means ferritin depletion. The body needs time and nutritional resources to rebuild those stores between cycles. If the period is heavy and the diet is not adequately replacing the lost iron, ferritin stores can become chronically depleted, producing persistent brain fog, fatigue, worsening ADHD symptoms, and worsening emotional regulation that looks exactly like psychiatric deterioration, but is actually nutritional. Specifically request ferritin when you speak with her doctor. not just iron. Ferritin. Other critical labs your daughter needs to understand her body better. Iron, serum iron, and TIBC, total iron and total iron binding capacity, tell you how much iron is circulating in the blood and how much capacity the body has to carry more. Check this alongside ferritin for a complete picture. CBC, which is a complete blood count. This is a broad panel that checks red blood cells, white blood cells, and platelets. In the context of heavy periods, the CBC will reveal whether she is anemic, whether her red blood cell count has dropped to a level that is affecting oxygen delivery throughout the body and brain. Anemia produces fatigue, brain fog, pallor, shortness of breath, and worsening cognitive function. It is not subtle when it's serious, but the early stages can look like depression, ADHD worsening, or motivational failure. Vitamin D. Vitamin D is technically a hormone, not just a vitamin. The body produces it through sun exposure and processes it into a hormone that acts throughout the body and brain. Vitamin D deficiency is extremely common, particularly in northern latitudes and in people who spend significant time indoors, which describes many neurodivergent teenagers who struggle with motivation and sleep disruption. Vitamin D deficiency is associated with depression, fatigue, low mood, weakened immune function, and worsening cognitive performance. Optimal levels for brain health are typically considered to be between 50 and 80 nanograms per milliliter, higher than the normal cutoff that most labs use, which may flag someone as deficient only when they're severely depleted. Request the actual number, not just normal or abnormal. Vitamin B12. B12 is essential for neurological function, including the maintenance of the myelin sheath, the protective coating on neurons that allows them to transmit signals efficiently. B12 deficiency can produce neurological symptoms, including brain fog, mood disruption, fatigue, and cognitive decline that overlap significantly with ADHD presentation. Girls and women who follow vegetarian or vegan diets are at higher risk because B12 is found primarily in animal products. B12 is also affected by some medications, including certain antacids and, in high doses, metformin. Thyroid panel. TSH, free T3, free T4. The thyroid gland produces hormones that regulate metabolism, energy, temperature, and critically mood and cognitive function. An underactive thyroid, hypothyroidism, can produce fatigue, brain fog, weight changes, low mood, constipation, cold intolerance, and cognitive slowing that mimics or worsens ADHD and depression. An overactive thyroid, hyperthyroidism, can produce anxiety, racing thoughts, insomnia, and emotional dysregulation. Thyroid dysfunction is more common in women than men and can emerge or worsen in the context of hormonal changes. Request a full thyroid panel, not just TSH, which is the screening measure, but also free T3 and free T4, which give a fuller picture of how the thyroid is actually functioning. Glucose and A1C. Blood glucose is the measure of sugar in the blood at the time of the test. A1C, hemoglobin A1C, is a measure of average blood sugar over the past 2 to 3 months. Both are relevant to ADHD because blood sugar fluctuations directly impact brain function, mood, and energy. When blood sugar drops rapidly, which can happen with meals that are high in simple carbohydrates and low in protein or fat, the brain loses its primary fuel source, and cognitive function, mood stability, and emotional regulation deteriorate quickly. For the ADHD brain that is already nutritionally sensitive and frequently forgets to eat regular meals, blood sugar instability is a significant but manageable contributor to symptom fluctuation. Comprehensive hormone panel. Depending on age and symptoms, it may be appropriate to assess estrogen, progesterone, and testosterone levels at specific points in the cycle, as well as DHEA and cortisol, which are stress-related hormones that interact with reproductive hormones. What if my daughter has heavy periods? Heavy periods are the hidden crisis and what the body must rebuild monthly. Heavy periods are so common among girls and women that they are almost universally normalized. That's just how it is. She'll grow out of it. Some women just bleed more heavily. But heavy periods clinically defined as soaking through a pad or tampon every hour for several consecutive hours, passing clots larger than a quarter, or bleeding that lasts longer than 7 days are not simply an inconvenience. They are a monthly physiological event that places enormous demands on the body and brain. Every heavy period loses a significant volume of blood. Blood contains iron bound to hemoglobin in red blood cells. When that blood leaves the body, the iron leaves with it. The body then must work to rebuild what was lost to produce new red blood cells, to restore ferritin stores, to replenish the hemoglobin that carries oxygen. This process takes time. It requires nutritional resources, specifically iron, B12, folate, and protein. And for many girls whose diets are not adequately supplying those resources, the rebuilding never fully completes before the next cycle begins. The result is a body and brain in a state of chronic partial depletion, persistent fatigue that doesn't resolve with sleep, brain fog that intensifies in the week after the period ends rather than clearing, worsening, ADHD symptoms that seem worse in the weeks following the period, cold hands and feet, pallor, difficulty concentrating. Emotional lability, which means mood that is easily and intensely disrupted, that goes beyond what the hormonal cycle alone would explain. If your daughter has heavy periods, this is not a minor gynecological footnote to the ADHD conversation. It is a central feature that must be addressed directly. This means requesting the CBC and ferritin labs I talked about earlier in this episode. It means having a conversation with her OBGYN about the volume of her periods. It means ensuring she is eating adequate iron-containing foods, red meat, dark leafy greens, legumes, and, if her levels warrant it, supplementing under medical supervision. Iron supplements must be taken correctly, typically with vitamin C, to enhance absorption, and not at the same time as calcium or certain medications that can inhibit absorption. This also means having a conversation about whether her heavy periods themselves warrant treatment, not just management. There are medical interventions that can significantly reduce period volume, from hormonal options to non-hormonal medications, and these interventions can have a meaningful positive effect on ADHD symptoms and quality of life by reducing the monthly iron loss that her brain is struggling to recover from. Birth control. What does it do? What birth control does to the hormonal system. Hormonal birth control, including combination pills containing synthetic estrogen and progestin-only pills, the mini pill, hormonal IUDs like Mirena, the implant, Nexplanon, the patch, and the ring works primarily by suppressing the body's natural hormonal cycle. Instead of the brain cycling through the rising and falling of natural estrogen and progesterone that drives ovulation, hormonal birth control delivers a steady, synthetic hormonal environment that prevents ovulation and changes the uterine lining. This synthetic hormonal environment does several things that are relevant to the ADHD and OCD brain. First, it eliminates the natural estrogen fluctuation. For some women with ADHD, this is stabilizing. Removing the dramatic highs and lows of the cycle creates a more consistent neurological baseline. For others, the synthetic progestins in most hormonal birth control have a different relationship with the brain's progesterone receptors than natural progesterone does, and can produce persistent low mood, flattened affect, which means emotional flatness, a reduced capacity to feel positive emotions, decreased motivation, brain fog, and reduced libido. Some women describe going on hormonal birth control and feeling like something turned off, like a dimmer switch was lowered on their entire inner life. Second, hormonal birth control significantly lowers the body's production of testosterone. While testosterone is often discussed exclusively in the context of men, women produce it too, and it plays an important role in motivation, confidence, energy, and libido. The synthetic estrogen in combination pills increases a protein called sex hormone binding globulin, SHBG, which binds to free testosterone and renders it unavailable to the body. This reduction in available testosterone can contribute to fatigue, low motivation, and emotional flatness, all of which overlap with and can worsen ADHD symptoms. Third, some research suggests that synthetic progestins in hormonal birth control may affect serotonin metabolism, which is relevant to both mood and OCD. Women who have a pre-existing vulnerability to low serotonin, which includes women with OCD, may be more susceptible to mood disruption on hormonal birth control. What happens when you come off birth control? Estrogen can surge as the body's own production reboots, sometimes producing temporary acne, bloating, and mood changes. The natural cycle may be irregular for several months as the hypothalamic pituitary ovarian axis, the hormonal signaling chain between the brain and the ovaries, reestablishes its rhythm. Women who had difficult periods, significant PMS, or PMDD-like symptoms before going on birth control may find those symptoms return, sometimes amplified, as the natural cycle resumes. The ADHD brain, which was accustomed to a synthetic hormonal baseline, may feel destabilized as it navigates an irregular and reemerging natural cycle. This transition period can look like psychiatric deterioration when it is actually hormonal recalibration. It is worth discussing openly with a physician who understands the intersection of hormonal health and neurodivergent brain function, and it is worth tracking symptoms carefully during this time rather than immediately assuming that medication needs to be changed or that something psychiatric has developed. The gut constipation, estrogen clearance, liver, gallbladder. The gut-brain connection. For girls and women with ADHD, the gut-brain connection matters for several reasons. ADHD is associated with dysbiosis, an imbalance in the gut microbiome, which is the community of bacteria and other microorganisms that live in the digestive tract and play a critical role in immune function, digestion, neurotransmitter production, and inflammation regulation. The ADHD brain's regulatory challenges extend to the digestive system delayed gastric emptying. Gut motility issues and constipation are significantly more common in people with ADHD than in the general population. Constipation, which means having fewer than 3 bowel movements per week or bowel movements that are difficult to pass, is not just uncomfortable. Daily bowel movements are important for health because the colon is one of the body's primary elimination routes for metabolic waste products, including used hormones. This brings us to estrogen clearance. Estrogen clearance and why constipation matters. After estrogen has done its job in the body, it is processed by the liver, an organ in the abdomen that performs hundreds of vital metabolic functions, including filtering toxins, processing nutrients, and metabolizing hormones. The liver packages used estrogen for elimination and sends it to the intestines via bile, a digestive fluid produced by the liver and stored in the gallbladder, a small pear-shaped organ just beneath the liver. The intestines are supposed to eliminate this packaged estrogen in the stool. But here is where constipation becomes a hormonal problem. When stool sits in the colon for too long, as it does in constipation, gut bacteria produce an enzyme called beta-glucuronidase that unpacks the used estrogen and allows it to be reabsorbed into the bloodstream. This means that instead of being eliminated, used estrogen recirculates in the body, contributing to estrogen excess, a state sometimes called estrogen dominance, which is associated with heavier periods, more severe PMS and PMDD symptoms, worse OCD, because excess estrogen, paradoxically, can interfere with serotonin balance, breast tenderness, bloating, and mood disruption. If she is not having regular daily bowel movements, her body may be recirculating hormones that were supposed to be eliminated, and those recirculated hormones may be contributing to the exact hormonal symptoms we've been discussing. Supporting daily bowel movements through adequate hydration, dietary fiber from vegetables and whole grains, magnesium supplementation, which also supports sleep and muscle relaxation, and physical movement is not a minor lifestyle recommendation. For a girl with ADHD, heavy periods, and hormonal mood disruption, gut regularity is a direct support for her hormonal health. The liver and the gallbladder. The liver is one of the most hardworking organs in the body. It filters the blood, processes medications, metabolizes hormones, converts nutrients into usable forms, and produces bile for digestion. For girls and women on medications, including ADHD medications and SSR, the liver is the organ doing the work of processing those medications. Liver function matters for how medications behave, how hormones are metabolized, and how efficiently the body clears waste products. The gallbladder stores the bile that the liver produces and releases it into the small intestine to help digest fats. Hormonal fluctuations, particularly the estrogen changes of the menstrual cycle, can affect gallbladder function. Women are more likely than men to develop gallstones, and the risk increases with hormonal birth control in pregnancy. If your daughter experiences recurring pain in the upper right abdomen, particularly after eating fatty foods, it is worth asking her doctor about gallbladder function. Histamine, allergies, serotonin, and dopamine. Histamine, the hidden mood disruptor. Histamine is a compound produced by cells in the immune system, the gut, and certain neurons in the brain. Most people know histamine as the substance that causes allergy symptoms, runny nose, itchy eyes, sneezing, hives. This is why antihistamine medications like Zyrtec, Benadryl, and Claritin exist. They block histamine receptors and reduce allergy symptoms. But histamine is not just an allergy chemical. In the brain, histamine acts as a neurotransmitter that regulates wakefulness, attention, and learning. Histamine also has a direct relationship with estrogen. Estrogen stimulates histamine release, and histamine stimulates estrogen production. This creates a feedback loop that is particularly relevant around ovulation and the late luteal phase. More critically, for the ADHD and OCD picture, histamine degrades serotonin. When histamine levels rise, as they can in response to allergies, certain foods, fermented foods, aged cheeses, wine, tomatoes, spinach, and leftover meats are high in histamine. Gut dysbiosis or hormonal fluctuation, serotonin availability can decrease. For a brain that is already managing OCD with limited serotonin resources, histamine surges can genuinely worsen intrusive thoughts and compulsions. Histamine intolerance, a condition in which the body has difficulty breaking down histamine, either because of insufficient production of the enzyme that degrades it, called diamine oxidase, or DAO, or because histamine intake exceeds the body's degradation capacity, can produce symptoms including headaches, flushing, heart palpitations, anxiety, brain fog, digestive distress, and mood disruption. These symptoms often worsen around ovulation and in the late luteal phase when estrogen peaks, serotonin. The mood stabilizer, impulse regulator, and OCD modulator. We have mentioned serotonin throughout this episode, but let me give it a proper introduction because it is that important. Serotonin is a neurotransmitter that is synthesized from the amino acid tryptophan found in foods like turkey, eggs, nuts, and seeds. It is involved in mood regulation, impulse control, sleep, digestion, social behavior, and the suppression of intrusive, repetitive thoughts. Serotonin is the primary neurotransmitter targeted by OCD treatment. It is also deeply involved in emotional regulation, which is one of the areas where ADHD creates the most significant challenges. When serotonin is low due to hormonal fluctuation, histamine burden, poor sleep, nutritional deficiency, or the natural limits of an individual's neurochemistry, emotional regulation deteriorates, OCD symptoms worsen, impulse control decreases, and the baseline sense of well-being drops. Supporting serotonin naturally involves adequate tryptophan intake from food, exposure to sunlight, which boosts serotonin production, physical movement. Exercise is one of the most reliable ways to boost serotonin, and the management of histamine burden through diet and gut health. These are complementary to, not replacements for, appropriate psychiatric medication when medication is indicated. Dopamine. The focus, motivation, and reward. Neurotransmitter. Dopamine is the neurotransmitter most central to ADHD. It is involved in attention, motivation, working memory, the ability to delay gratification, the experience of reward and pleasure, and the initiation of goal-directed behavior. The ADHD brain produces, releases, and receives dopamine differently from the typically developing brain, not in a way that makes it deficient overall, but in a way that makes dopamine less available in the prefrontal cortex and other areas that support executive function. Estrogen, as we've discussed, supports dopamine. Iron supports dopamine production. Sleep is critical for dopamine receptor resensitization. When sleep is inadequate, dopamine receptors become less responsive, which worsens the ADHD brain's already compromised relationship with dopamine. Exercise increases dopamine release, and gaming, screens, and certain kinds of high-stimulation activities can rapidly release large amounts of dopamine in short bursts, which creates a compelling return to those activities, but also depletes the dopamine system over time, making everyday tasks and rewards feel even less accessible. If you are a parent listening to this episode, you may be feeling one of several things simultaneously. You may feel relief, finally, an explanation for what you've been witnessing. You may feel grief for the years of conflict that might have been navigated differently with this information. You may feel guilt, which I want to address directly. Guilt without action is a trap. What I want to offer instead is self-compassion and a new frame. You were not told. The medical system was not telling you. The school was not telling you. The dominant cultural narrative about girls and their behavior was not giving you the tools to understand what was happening in your daughter's brain and body. You interpreted her behavior through the lens you had, and now you are in a conversation that is giving you a new lens. What you do with this lens going forward is what matters. Using the lens of Bowen family systems theory, the framework I return to again and again in my work, I want to name something that is important for parents. Differentiation of self means your ability to maintain your own identity, your emotional stability, and your thoughtful responses even when the family system around you is activated. When your daughter is in a hormonal crisis, raging, flooded, emotionally dysregulated, sensory overwhelmed, your differentiation is the most powerful tool available. Not because you are emotionally absent or cold, but because the storm needs someone who is not also in the storm. Your groundedness becomes the container that her nervous system can eventually co-regulate with. This is not easy. This is going to be very hard work, and this is the work of parenting a neurodivergent daughter through the hormonal complexity of adolescence and early adulthood. You deserve support in this too. A therapist, a coach, a community where you can process what this is like for you and not just manage what it is like for her. If you are a young woman listening to this, maybe you're in your late teens, your 20s, maybe you're listening because your mom forwarded you this episode or because you found it yourself during a 3 a.m. search for language for the thing that has been happening to you for years. I want to speak directly to you for a moment. What has been happening to you is real. The week you feel almost okay, almost functional, almost like a version of yourself you recognize and don't hate that is real. The week everything collapses, the fog, the rage, the OCD thoughts, the socks that feel wrong, the exhaustion that doesn't respond to sleep that is also real. Neither version of you is the true you and the other a fraud. Both are you navigating a brain and body that were not well understood by the people who were supposed to help you understand them. You are not broken, lazy, dramatic, irrational, or too much. You are a person with a neurodivergent brain navigating a monthly hormonal cycle in a body that produces real, measurable changes in your neurochemistry every single week, and nobody explained this to you. Here is what I want you to do with this information. Start tracking. You don't need a complicated app. You need a note on your phone that logs every day where you are in your cycle, your energy level on a scale of 1 to 10, your mood, your OCD intensity if that is relevant, how your medication felt, and any major events. After 2 or 3 months, patterns will emerge that will feel revelatory. Bring this information to your doctors, your psychiatrist, your OB/GYN, your primary care physician. Ask explicitly for ferritin, vitamin D, B12, thyroid, and glucose. Bring your tracking logs. Be specific. In the 10 days before my period, my ADHD medication feels less effective and my OCD is significantly worse, is actionable clinical information. Advocate for yourself with that specificity. Find a therapist who understands both ADHD and OCD. The intersection of these two conditions, in the context of hormonal cycles, requires a clinical sophistication that not every therapist has. Ask explicitly whether they have experience with ADHD in women, with OCD, and with the hormonal dimensions of these conditions. You deserve a clinician who speaks your language, and please talk to someone you trust, a parent, a friend, a therapist, a community. The shame that accompanies the monthly collapse is one of the heaviest parts of this experience. The antidote to shame is being truly known by another person and still accepted. You deserve to be known. For parents who are listening to this episode, track the cycle. Even without your daughter's direct cooperation, you can observe and log patterns: which weeks she struggles more, which weeks she is more available, which weeks conflict escalates. 3 months of tracking will reveal patterns that will fundamentally change how you interpret her behavior. Adjust the timing of difficult conversations. Use the follicular phase the week or two after her period ends for important discussions, new expectations, or planning conversations. Reduce demands in the late luteal phase where possible. This is not permissiveness. This is strategic parenting that works with her neurology rather than against it. Prioritize sleep architecture in your household. Consistent bedtime and wake times, reduced blue light in the evening, phones outside the bedroom if possible, and a sleep environment that is cool and dark. This is the highest leverage intervention that requires no prescription. Request the right labs: ferritin, iron, CBC, vitamin D, B12, thyroid panel, and glucose or A1C. Bring this list to her next medical appointment. Support daily bowel movements through hydration, dietary fiber, and if needed, magnesium glycinate taken at night, which supports both gut motility and sleep. Discuss with her physician before adding any supplements. For young women, you may need to download a cycle tracking app. There are many that allow symptom logging alongside cycle tracking. Clue, Flow, and others allow you to track mood, energy, OCD intensity, medication effectiveness, and physical symptoms. After 3 months, bring the data to your appointments. Address the basics: sleep, hydration, protein with every meal. Protein supports neurotransmitter production, iron-rich foods, sun exposure, or vitamin D supplementation under medical guidance, and physical movement. Even a 20-minute walk daily has measurable effects on dopamine, serotonin, and emotional regulation. We covered an enormous amount of territory today, and I am aware that some of what we discussed may feel overwhelming. Please hear this. You do not have to implement everything at once. Start with one thing. Pick the thing that resonated most. Track the cycle for 30 days. Request the ferritin test at the next appointment. Begin a conversation with her prescribing physician about hormonal patterns in medication effectiveness. Move toward one slightly better understanding. Behavior is never just behavior. What your daughter is experiencing, what you may yourself be experiencing is a real, biological, neurological, and hormonal story that deserves to be told with accuracy, compassion, and specificity. That is what I try to do here in every single episode. The Path to Peace Therapy podcast is provided for educational and informational purposes only. The content reflects general parenting strategies, family systems concepts, and insights related to ADHD, anxiety, OCD, emotional regulation, and child development. It is not intended to diagnose, treat, cure, or prevent any medical or mental health condition, nor is it a substitute for professional advice, evaluation, diagnosis, or treatment. If today's episode helped you, please share it. Forward it to the mom who is sitting across from her daughter, wondering what is wrong. Forward it to the young woman who is sitting in her room believing the same thing. Forward it to the physician, the therapist, the teacher who could use this language. Every person who finds this conversation and finally has words for their experience is one step closer to getting the support they actually need. Thank you for being here. Thank you for listening. I'm Stephanie Buckley, and I'll see you next time on the Path to Peace Therapy podcast.